Hello everybody. How we doing today? This is about it. We got 4 more pieces to our emotion puzzle and then we're out of here. But we're not really out of here because we'll be with emotions for the rest of our lives. So it's just our brief exploration this 14-15 weeks that we've shared together virtually. And maybe there's some irony involved with that, because as we look at these 2 lectures, especially lecture 10, we're going to look at digital emotions. So the fact that we are virtual maybe kind of, represents this strange irony to the end of the course. I would certainly prefer it not to be virtual. I'm very sad that we haven't been together. I can picture the room that we probably would have been in, or one of the 2 rooms, and what it would be like and how we would interact. And that's largely been taken away from us. But nonetheless, we figure out some way to get it done. And remember, we talked about Charles Darwin in this course, and Charles Darwin never said survival of the fittest. He said survival of that which is best able to adapt to its circumstances. And I think COVID has challenged us in that regard. And we see people that seem to be adapting, and we see other people that don't seem to be adapting. I guess one of the big kind of let's try this out as a thought experiment. Well, what if COVID actually, didn't necessarily kill people but made them sterile? How would that shake out from an evolutionary perspective? Regardless, I'll leave you with that idea. We've talked a lot of emotion theory, and now I'm going to start tearing it down. So the next 2 lectures represent kind of tearing it down and rethinking where we've been, and that will help us in our desire to move forward. And then I've also got 2 emotions in focus, so we're going to look at those as well. So you could kind of take 9, 9.1, 10, and 10.1 as a package deal within a package called Psychology of Emotion. So let's talk about affect theory and post-structuralist accounts. We'll be headed towards some assignments, so we'll have that to look at. But what's ahead for us in the immediate future here? Well, the not phase, and we're going to spend a little time talking about that. Then we're going to talk about structuralism so that we can produce the counterpoint that is post-structuralism. I want to talk about affect theory, and affect theory resonates with me to a greater and greater extent as I think about this more and more. And then the disembodied future, we're going to start talking about separation of mind and body and virtual existence. But let's begin with the not phase. And what the hell is the not phase? Well, it's a fascinating term, if nothing else. And you guys have become, pretty facile with facial recognition, I hope. I hope you've been practicing on your friends and partners, etc., watching TV, whatever. And we can see here then the figure 1 is negative moral judgment, right? So what constitutes negative moral judgment? Well, anger, certainly, and we can recognize from, and notice we've got the actual labeled facial constructs here. So anger in 1, disgust, and we see that upturned nose especially in B, and then C, contempt, and remember contempt is always that kind of asymmetric mouth movement. And then finally, what is D? Because this is a new one for us, at least we haven't talked about this before, and yes, you probably guessed correctly. This is the not face. But when we look at facial coding, look at what it allows us to do, because what we see is the activation of 4, we see the activation of 10, and we see the activation of 17 to combine for this kind of universal disapproval, the not face. So here's 4 examples of the not face, and if you see this, then you better think about what you're saying and maybe revisit this conversation with the person that you're engaged with. So you see the furrowed brow, the pressed lips, the raised chin. We make it when we convey negative sentiments such as, I don't agree with this, I'm not buying it, right? And that comprises the not face. So let's look at a little research in the not face, and if we're looking at the coding of facial expression, expressions. Yeah, we could be looking at Ekman, but remember Alexei Martinez? Well, this is where I want to go back to Alexei and to the Ohio State legacy. And for those of you who are psychology majors at Ohio State, let's face it, you couldn't have done a hell of a lot better across the United States, right? This is a premier program of research in psychology. And notice it's not just psychology departments, but communication, engineering, computer science, all dabble in psychology as well. So what do we see here is the researchers discovered that ASL, American Sign Language speakers, right, sometimes make the not face instead of signing the word not. That's the use of facial expression in ASL that was previously undocumented. And this is what research brings us, right? To our knowledge, this is the first evidence that the facial expressions we use to communicate negative moral judgment have been compounded, right, into a unique universal part of language. So this is from Martinez, and we know he's the cognitive scientist and the professor of electrical engineering. So where did language come from? Well, this is a big question, right? It's a question the scientific community has grappled for a very long time, he continued. This study strongly suggests a link between language and facial expressions of emotion. That's kind of fascinating to think. That is language in part a creation of the need to express, or the need to verbally express what's showing on our face. So did the facial expression that represents an emotion come first, and then language is an add-on? And that's a really interesting kind of take or approach on this, especially as you see we move through lessons 9 and 10 here. So for this study, the researcher hypothesized that if a universal not face existed, it was likely to be a combination of 3 basic facial expressions that indicate moral disagreement, right? And that would be anger, disgust, and contempt, as we saw in those initial facial expression slides. So is the not face then universal negation? If the grammatical marker of negation is universal, then the researchers reason that the study participants would make similar facial expressions when using that grammatical marker, right? Regardless of which language they were signing in. So we look at this universality of facial expressions as Ekman did, but now we're associating it with language, right? And this is regardless of whether they're speaking or signing. And this is a nice way to look at it when you think about it, because spoken language and then sign language, right, if it works across both in a consistent manner, that tells us even more. So they should make the same not face in conjunction with or in lieu of the spoken or sign marker. The facial expression not only exists, but in some instances, it's the only marker of negation in a signed sentence, Martinez found. Sometimes the only way you can tell the meaning of the sentence is negative is that the person made the not face when they signed it. And that's fascinating, and it points to the universality of the expression. Now, let's flip it around, because you guys, this is Ohio State, and this is, you know, about many of us training to become leaders. And what does that mean to be a leader? And leadership can take place within a family, within a community, within an organization, right? Within a school organization, within a team. So leadership is kind of a universal construct. Detecting facial expressions, man, this is an important skill for a leader. You know, as a leader, being able to identify the not face in your subordinates can help you notice and act upon employee satisfaction before descends into behavioral problems, especially disengagement. And data shows it's estimated that 52% of employees in the United States are disengaged, right? They just, the meaning, they show up to work, they do the bare minimum so that they don't get fired, they dislike their work, they disagree with their manager or company, or they lack a sense of purpose or pride in their work. And this lack of engagement has huge financial impacts because employees fail to produce at optimal levels and are less willing to be able to innovate and adapt to change. So being able to recognize these facial expressions, they're cues. They say, hey, something is wrong. And as a leader, let's face it, we see lots of studies of people who are in high positions, in elevated positions, that don't care to even read people's expressions because it doesn't matter, because they're the boss and people have to do what they say and they don't give a shit what they feel about it anyway. That's kind of an old school manager, an old school dictatorial boss. The leader of the future is someone who's sensitive to the needs and responses of their people. And to the extent that they engineer an environment where people can develop, where they can self-actualize, when they can behave authentically, when they use science to understand the process and the system in which they're operating, right, then we see greater efficiency, a reduction of costs, and greater profits. Greater quality. Those all go together. And if you want to understand more about that relationship, I'd love to see you in organizational psychology, typically in the fall, where we discuss just that. But being a leader means knowing your people first and foremost. Right? And remember, who's the most important person in this relationship? Do you remember the Derek Stivers video? Who is the most important? How do you start a movement? Remember the importance of the first follower. So as a leader, you better be sensitive to your followers, because that's what's going to make your game or not. Right? Okay. So enough on the not phase, and especially as it applies as we kind of segued into leadership. Let's talk about structuralism and post-structuralism. Let's start tearing down the structure. But first, what is the structure? Structuralism is to understand human culture, one must study the signs and symbols that structure it. So we've hinted at this throughout the course that well, the simple question, if there's no word for it, can you feel it, right? And from a structuralist point of view, then, everything that is available to us is part of the structure in which we're embedded. And cultural research, especially cross-cultural research, shows us how culture, that structure of culture, affects people differently depending on their culture. And what's the most notable study of in cross-cultural research? What is the dimension that becomes most interesting? Is usually individualistic versus collectivist cultures and the differences that derive from those cultural structures as far as expectations, what people learn, and what people are allowed to do and what they're not allowed to do. So a structuralist looks and says, you know, in this case, we're largely products of our structure, and the structure combines what we can think, what we can feel, what we can say. This structure is our world when it gets right down to it. So if we're embedded in this structure, then it's easy for a structuralist to argue that autonomy, freedom, free will, they don't exist. They might be presented to us as ideas within the structure. But if the structure is already kind of determining and limiting who we are and what we can do, then these autonomy, free will, freedom are really kind of nice concepts, but maybe don't exist within the reality of that structure. And you're free to agree or disagree with that, right? This is a structuralist account. Behavior is determined by language systems as an example of structure. So if there's not a word for it, you can't think it, nor can you feel it. And note that we do think in words, right? And that's kind of an interesting issue in and of itself. Now, structuralists come in many different flavors, and two examples then. For Karl Marx, right, the structure is economic. So when Marx wants to explain behavior, as he did quite eloquently, it really has to do with the structure, the economic structure, and that then affords us opportunities or denies us opportunities, especially with our tied to our position within that structure. Now, for Sigmund Freud, the structure is the psyche. And if you want to understand Sigmund Freud, and I hope we walk away from this course with a better understanding of Freud than we had before we entered the course, because the more I study Freud, the more of a fan I become. Yes, there's a lot of things to argue negatively about Freud, but there's so many positive contributions. And for Freud, the structure is the psyche. So if you want to understand yourself and you want to understand your relationship to the world, you need to understand that your mind is a tripart construction of id, ego, and superego. Right? And from there, then it all becomes explanatory. But notice that these are two different structures that provide two very different explanations of our being as humans, our being as individuals, our being in the world. Right? So do we live with an illusion do we live with a myth, right? At any given moment in theoretical understanding, we experience only limited aspects of the world. We can't experience it all at any given moment. And some of what we experience is based on falsehoods embedded in some of the discourses we've learned. And these are discourses, these are narratives that are the structure. So this way of looking at the world, the way of understanding the world, the way of explaining the world, right, is confines and constrains us, right? And to the extent it's true, awesome. To the extent it's not true, and what the hell does true mean within this context, right? So bottom line, though, we live within a structure that explains the world to us. And there's no guarantee that the structure is correct. And we know that there's multiple structures. So which structure is correct? And you know, it's another question for those who are religious, you know, and they say, well, God. And then, you know, someone who's not religious, right, might say, well, which God? Because as an outsider to religion, and I observe the world, I notice people adhere to this religion or this doctrine or that religion or that religion, and they all, you know, presuppose their own gods. As an outsider, when I step outside of the religious structure and someone says to me, well, God, and then I can simply ask the question, well, which God? Because I see multiple structures, of which God is responsible for each one. So structuralism, and one of the ways that we can avoid living the illusion or living the myth, is to step outside of the structure to the extent that we can, to the extent that that's possible. And this is what maybe the post-structuralists would have as a recommendation for us. So Derrida pioneered deconstructionalism. It's an attempt to decode the ambiguities, the binary thinking, and contradictions to arrive at underlying phenomenon that describe and explain human behavior. And we've seen this, I guess one area to look at is in gender studies, because we've been, you know, our structure, and many cultures maintain this structure where we have man, we have woman, and relationships are between man and woman, and it's binary. It's either or, right? And there's all kinds of binaries that we face in this regard. Those are imposed to us, right, on the basis of these structures. The structure creates a category, the binary category, the this or that kind of thinking. But it's structural. It's not necessarily the truth once you step outside of the structure and hold it up to the light of day. So implied that the structuralist approach is little more than a tautological in that the structure explains the structure, but the structure is designed to protect and maintain, right, the structure. In that approach, little new knowledge is gained, right? That we don't say, well, this is the way it is, and why is it that way? Well, because the structure says it's that way. Well, why does the structure say that's that way? Well, because that's the way it is. And notice I've explained nothing. That is the essence of being tautological, is you use your answer as the question to the question as the answer. Right? So post-structuralism comes at this, and it rests on the assumption that structures we use to understand our world prevent us from looking beyond what constitutes the very fabric of our being. So we're robbed, according to post-structuralism, of part of our being, some of our being, because the structure only allows for a certain amount of being. Right? Now, we can look at textual analysis as one window into this. The self, right? And you can take a course in the self here, and I hope you do. Psychology of the self, right? The self is a fictional construct. It's comprised of conflict, tension, knowledge. It's the stories, it's the narratives that we create as we move through life. Right? And it's the structure that determines the allowable narrative. So, while a piece of writing is thought to be an expression of the author's self, is the reader any less important? So when we read and we say, well, someone wrote this, and because someone wrote this, it came out of them. So it is, you know, we can argue a part of their self, right? A part of their thinking, if you will. But is the person who's reading it, the interpreter, any less important? First of all, who was it written for? I mean, I'm planning when I retire from teaching, I want to devote myself to writing. And am I writing for myself or am I writing for others? Well, there's some stories there's some narratives that I want to advance, but they require an audience, right? So most writers write for somebody. Who is, though, when interpreting a text, who's correct? The writer or the reader? Well, I wrote it, so that's what it is, but it doesn't exist without the eyes upon it to read it. So the meaning is thus potentially in conflict. Whose interpretation is correct? The reader, the author, or is it the negotiation between the two? Is it a majority rules situation, right? The intent is a fictional construct as well. That is, well, this is my intent in writing this, but again, that's, the result of the structure. Whose intent? And if we look at structuralism and there's little in the way of free will, autonomy, or freedom, then the question of whose intent becomes even more problematic. So a variety of perspectives is required to create a multifaceted interpretation of text. And I think this is why often you'll find that your professors have you read or in groups, right, and share your ideas in groups. Because this allows then for us to be exposed to other people's interpretations of the same text as well. And notice that's not something that's necessarily afforded to us about ourselves and as we move through life. So, but this is where the text analysis becomes all important, and this is why we've practiced it in this class. As we are in wrap-up mode, so a lot of stuff is starting to come together. But if you're looking for resolution in this coming together, I'm sorry, I'm not going to go there. I'm not going towards resolution. I'm going to creating and generating more questions, right? And I promised you that at the beginning of the course. We will leave this course, if I do my job well, according to me, if I do my job well, then we will leave with more questions than we arrived with. And at that point, we'll say job well done. So I want to go to affect theory, but let's break and